Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now what we have here is a variation of a graphics card that exists in a few different forms, though it seems no company but ASUS released one quite the same. This was sent in from an individual by the name of William, so if you are watching, thank you, because it's always interesting to look at these harder to find GPUs. I wouldn't say this is particularly rare, but let's talk about what exactly we have here, why it exists and whether it can play games. Back in 2013, Nvidia launched the GTX 760. The reference specs of the card included 2GB of GDDR5 and a 256-bit bus width. Some vendors did release 4GB models and speeds varied depending on which one you opted for. The same year we saw the introduction of OEM 760s, which had a reduced 192-bit bus width, 1.5 gigs of VRAM, lower reference clocks and a reduced 130W TDP, down from 170. It was basically a rebrand of 2012's 660 OEM and could be found in certain pre-builds. As you can imagine, an OEM 760 would have performed quite differently to a standard card, but that's not to say it wasn't capable in its own right at the time. A quick search on eBay reveals OEM 760s from HP, Zotac and Dell, all of which are pretty cheap these days, but 1.5GB of VRAM just isn't going to cut it. Luckily for us though, we have the ASUS version, which has, count it, 3GB of GDDR5. That's right, a whole 1.5 gigs extra. This still packs the same cut down specs of the other offerings, most relevant being the reduced memory bandwidth. Oh, and it lacks modern driver support in 2024, but it will still do a pretty fine job in older AAA titles, and as far as I can tell, it is the only OEM 3GB 760 that was produced. Battlefield 5 is up first then, and visually it still holds up. It runs at 1080p, sort of, because we're using a 70% resolution scale factor. The settings are also at their respective lowest. You may notice I have two VRAM stats on screen here, VRAM and VRAM usage / process. These will show the allocated and utilised memory respectively. While the vast majority of the card's memory was often assigned to the tested games, we were still limited to lower settings that generally utilise less than 2 gigs anyway, because of the card's somewhat lacklustre capabilities in 2024. On occasion, this 3GB card did use more than 1.5 gigs, the amount the standard 760 OEM has, so that's worth noting. As a side note, I am really enjoying Battlefield 5 and it's clear to see why it's still so popular years after release. Turns out I'm not too terrible at it either, and of course its age means it will run just fine on this card, albeit with some sacrifices. Up next we have The Witcher 3 with the next gen patch applied. This gives us access to features like ray tracing and FSR2, but as I've demonstrated before, the 700 series cards will not work with this, and while the FPS overlay does report higher numbers with Fidelity FX Super Resolution turned on, it doesn't mean much when we can't actually see what we're playing. That's why it's best to stick to DX11 mode and run the game at 900p with the lowest settings. The average frame rate is pretty good, but there are a few dips and drops here and there. You may have noticed I've paired this card with a Ryzen 5 1600AF, as I think it makes far more sense to test a card like this with what is now a pretty affordable processor. While Counter-Strike 2 is often thought of as a more CPU intensive game, it's actually our 3GB 760 that is the limitation here. With 1080p in the low settings, the card is using less than 2 gigs of memory, but the game is running better than I anticipated. Now this OEM card has an on-paper boost clock of 888MHz, but in real-world testing I often saw it exceed 1GHz, which can be seen here too. All in all, we are getting at least 100 FPS on average with somewhat respectable percentile lows, so CS2 is definitely what I'd call more than playable. I wasn't expecting any problems with GTA 5, though I do suspect that this will be the last GTA game that we can enjoy on this card. 90 FPS here with the high settings and some consistent percentile lows as well make for a very nice gaming experience. I started off with the normal settings and we saw over 100 FPS, so switching everything to high was more than doable. I've been pretty impressed with the cooling performance as well. The heatsink and fan combo may look pretty basic, but it does an adequate job, and the card stays at less than 70 degrees most of the time. Somehow Cyberpunk 2077 runs as well, though FSR is off limits once again, as it will cause black screen problems. Because of this, native 720p is our best bet, and Surprisingly, 30 FPS was achievable. We can see that the card is utilising at least 1.5 gigs of memory, more than the regular OEM variant offers, but we have to remember that the reduced bus width is probably hampering our overall experience. Still, I'd consider 30 FPS on a card of this age and obsoleteness, if that's even a word, sort of playable. Before we move on to a couple of comparisons, it's worth taking a quick look at Red Dead Redemption 2. The 3 gigs of VRAM mean we can actually choose a higher texture option straight from the menu. In the past, we've been limited to low, even with the standard 2 gig card. Speaking of limitations, 900p was the best bet, though 720p probably would have made even more sense, as we were just about scraping 30 frames per second. We're also using at least 2 gigs of VRAM here, so this is a pretty demanding one for the ASUS OEM 760. Now, I don't have a 1.5 gig OEM card for comparison, but I do have a few results from when I tested a standard 2 gig card, and I'll put a few figures up on screen now. The settings used here might vary from the ones used in the earlier gameplay tests for comparison's sake. To be very honest, a standard 2 gig 760 is not only more common on second-hand sites, but it's going to be the better buy. 1% figures are all over the place for both cards, but in terms of an average, the 256-bit standard card will likely do better every time. The truth of the matter is though, a 760, OEM or otherwise, should probably be avoided altogether in 2024, but I thought it would be interesting to take a look at this ASUS-Exclusive 3 gig version, just to see what it was capable of. It was quite interesting that ASUS were the only ones to make an OEM variant with double the VRAM. Thanks again to William for sending the card in, and thank you all for watching.